2006 if I remember it right. We were asked to create our own newspaper. That means literally visiting police stations, murder or accident scenes, funeral homes, and the like. This is because we need factual information since our subject back then was one of our majors. I took broadcast journalism, by the way. When we finally finished editing our news articles, the entire group went to our house for an overnight layout. I was very sick back then because I got wet for several days trying to get a good scoop for my news. While using our home computer, something went wrong with the CD. It wouldn't load in the CD-ROM, so my classmate, Daniel, not his real name, suggested that we go to his house because he got a backup copy of our files in his computer. They told me just to stay at home and communicate with them through text messaging since I was dead sick. Everyone agreed with the suggestion and packed up our stuff, and then another classmate, Susie, who is also a friend, sat on my parents' bed. We were doing the project in the master's bedroom since the computer was set up there. Her face was blank for a minute, and when she recovered, she told the whole group just to stay in her house and do what we can for the project. Daniel asked her why, but she just kept saying, "No, please, let's stay here, or if we want, we can leave early in the morning after sunrise." I was just laying on the bed, looking at her because I knew something was wrong. After a few moments of convincing, the group finally decided to wait till sunrise. By then, my mom came and told me to take a rest in my room and she'll be sleeping with me so I can sleep well. When I'm sick, I'm such a crybaby. I then went to my room, which was located in the second floor, and laid on my bed. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but then after a few minutes, I started seeing this very bright light on a corner near my closet. I was seeing that bright light with my eyes closed. It was very bright, and then I started to see a form, a body of a man wearing slacks and I think a long sleeve shirt. I don't know if he was wearing white clothes or he was just shining, because all I knew is he was wearing white and he was shining. He was a guy. I knew for sure because of his shape, but he was headless. The moment I realized he was headless, he was gone. I wasn't scared though. I've seen spirits around before. After I calmed myself, I texted Susie, because before I went to my room, she was crying. I said, "What did you see?" She replied. She said she just suddenly saw right before her eyes a scene, Daniel being held by a hold-upper and they were about to cut his head. She wasn't sure if everyone was at the scene, but she knew some of them were there. But the main focus was with Daniel. She said that was the main reason why she burst into tears. She was hell scared by what she saw and thought it was a premonition of something bad. That is why she convinced the group not to leave. I then told her about what I saw, the headless guy, and we both agreed that what we saw were connected. After a few hours, probably around 4 a.m., Daniel's sister texted him and said she was on her way home from work. She works graveyard shift for this company named Nano in Clark Field, and she happened to pass by a crime scene, like a guy was robbed and was hanging down a tree with his head almost unattached to his body. And they said the time the crime happened was the time that they were about to leave our house and pass that way. Do you guys think everything was connected or something? Did my friend have a premonition? Who was the headless guy I saw? I've just joined and have a lot of stories to share. Some are not long, so some of my posts will have a couple of stories just to meet the required 1,500 characters. I was standing behind the counter in the spiritual bookstore I worked for 8 years some years ago. The counter faced the entrance to the store, with a few steps leading up from street level. It was a rather busy time of the day, so we were 3 clerks behind the counter. Suddenly, I noticed a man coming up the stairs, casually dressed, walking normally, looking down in front of him. When he reached the top of the stairs, 8 feet from where I was standing, he lifted his face and stared at me, and I stared into the blackest blackness in his eyes. I didn't just get chills. My heart skipped a beat. I felt as if the air was knocked out of me, and I turned my back to him, but in that same moment, I was sure that he would jump the counter and go for my throat, either with his hands or with his teeth. So I ran out from behind the counter, right through the store, and up into the back office where I stayed for a long time, until I was sure he'd left. It was a really strong feeling. I'm positive I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't run away. I don't know why, but that man, or whatever he was out to get me. Luckily, I haven't encountered other black-eyed beings since then. Having read through some of the stories here, I can see that it's common that kids that have black eyes, but this was a fully grown man. He didn't get to talk to me, but the feelings described by those who have seen the kids are pretty much the same as mine. Thanks for reading. John King Bookstore is on West Lafayette Street in downtown Detroit. It's located in a huge 4-story turn-of-the-last-century building that was once a glove factory. They specialized in used and rare books, and at one time they had around 1,000 volumes. Not long ago, I heard a rumor recently that John King was going to close because it was failing financially. I hope that isn't true since it's such a unique place. Books stacked from floor to ceiling in such rough order that an employee couldn't tell you if they had a particular title without first doing a vigorous search. The place smells musty from yellowing pages and disintegrating leather covers. Even though I've only been there for a couple of times with a friend, Caroline, who introduced me to the place, John King has made an impression on me. Caroline is a fan of the supernatural, even though she hasn't experienced anything of that sort herself. Once we stumbled into a conversation about ghosts. She was enthralled when I admitted I had encountered some spirits. So as we were driving to John King a few years back, she told me one of the employees said the 4th floor was supposed to be haunted. The spirit was thought to be a man who'd worked at a glove factory long ago. She asked me to check it out and let her know if there was really a spirit there hanging out. I said ghosts scare me and I never go hunting for them, but it's a huge building, very quiet, with usually only a handful of customers wandering by themselves from floor to floor. Caroline and I went our separate ways because we're interested in different types of books, so I ended up browsing alone through empty book-lined rooms. After we paid for our books and got into the car, she asked excitedly if I'd picked up on anything. I had, even though I was trying not to. I told her I hadn't run into anything on the 4th floor, but on the 3rd floor, there was a gentle older male entity who had once worked at the bookstore. He'd been in love with a young woman who also worked there, although she only thought of him as a friend. So the next time Caroline went to John King, she told me one of the employees what I'd said. The employee immediately remembered 2 former colleagues, one now deceased, whose friendship seemed like the kind I'd described. When I was a child, maybe at the age of 9 or 10, me and my cousins visited my grandparents' house regularly. There was nothing creepy about the house, as we loved going there to see each other, as well as our grandparents themselves. One night, we decided to play a game with our grandmother in which she would turn the lights on in the back 3 rooms of the house and hide under a sheet somewhere in said 3 rooms. We would get a flashlight to track her down, and upon finding her, our usual reaction was to shriek in excitement and run back to our grandfather who was sitting in the living room watching TV. We played again and again, each time running past the bathroom and kitchen en route to the living room. I can't remember how many times we played until the only paranormal event in my entire 19 years occurred. We broke out in a sprint for the living room, only this time, when we rushed past the kitchen, I caught a quick glance of what seemed to be a large priest or preacher, as I'm not sure exactly what it was, sitting at the table. My heart probably skipped a beat as I lunged onto the couch, burying my face in the pillows with fear. I didn't make a sound and I didn't move. I just pretended to be asleep as my younger cousin pushed and poked me, urging me to play again. I kept my head down, in fear of what I had just seen. I can't remember how long I stayed on the couch, pretending to be in my own little world in which I thought I was alone. I eventually snapped out of it and asked my older cousin if he had seen what I had seen in the kitchen. He responded with a yes. Since then, I recalled the event to him maybe 5 or so years later, and he still stood strong that he had seen the priest as well. To others it may not seem that big of a deal, but I feel as if I should remember that moment more than I do. Maybe it was that I was merely a kid, but I look back at that moment and don't really feel any emotion towards it. I don't feel any emotion towards it, and that's scarier than the memory. About 15 years ago, I was employed as an editor for a company in mid-Michigan that owned a local newspaper. After I'd been with the company for about a year, the 2 papers I worked on were moved to new offices in nearby county seat. One of those places in central Michigan that still has a quaint downtown with Greek Revival architecture. We were in a renovated older building that sat next to a huge, repudiated, haunted cemetery. From the first day I walked into the newspaper office, I knew this wouldn't be a comfortable experience for me because I felt an unseen presence at the far end of our suite. My office was near the front. If I walked the length of the suite, before I reached the halfway point, I would sense I was crossing an invisible line. Goosebumps would start to pop out on my arms and I'd start feeling chills. I had a sudden urge to turn and run from the building, so I always stayed as far away from that part of the office suite as possible. Some of you have described being able to see spirit in your mind. That's usually been my experience. I gradually come to realize that the ghost in our office was a youngish man, maybe late 30s or early 40s, with brownish hair and eyes and some kind of beard. He was dressed like a worker or a farmhand, denim overalls, a checkered shirt, and heavy boots that were muddy, and he seemed to be smiling. He gave me the impression of being friendly. I think maybe he was even amused that he scared me, but I never felt he intended to threaten me. He probably wanted someone to pick up on his presence. Every Thursday, I had to work late into the night, laying out my new 2 newspapers and sending them online, page by page, to production. I never looked forward to working there alone at night, but that's not the way things started off. At first, several other staff members stayed late on the same night to finish their own papers, but organizational changes moved them to offices in another town. So eventually, I worked alone in the building one evening a week. I came to dread Thursdays because our resident ghosts always paid me a visit. First, there would be muffled bumps and knocks from the far end of the suite. Then I could hear footsteps moving towards the middle area, where our computer server was located. After a few minutes of unidentifiable banging and creaking sounds, the footsteps would start again, heading straight to my office door. Then I could sense the man standing in my doorway. I would crank up some music as loud as I could and refuse to look in the visitor's direction. He didn't enter the office, but I could feel him watching me from the doorway. When I was ready to leave, he usually walked behind me right to the outer door. I couldn't shake off the shivers until I was safe at home. Finally, in desperation, I decided to call in my own personal ghostbuster, my husband. I knew from past experiences that my hubby somehow unconsciously acts as a ghost repellent. I don't understand how or why this works. He's actually tone deaf when it comes to paranormal experiences, but spirits avoid him. So I asked hubby to drive straight from his own job in another city to sit with me on Thursday nights until I finish my own work. He's a sweetie pie. He agreed to sacrifice his Thursday nights, and hallelujah, it turned out to be a perfect solution because the presence kept his distance whenever hubby showed up. It wasn't until I left a newspaper for a different job that I discovered a few of my coworkers had also run into the ghost. We traded stories about being alone in the office and what we thought the entity looked like. Sharing the creepy experiences with my former work friends made me feel a little bit better. Several years later, I'd quit that job. I'd found myself in town again near the newspaper office, so I decided to stop by for a visit. I was in luck. 2 friends from the old days happened to be there instead of out covering stories. We took a 15-minute coffee break to catch up back in the office, where things were quieter. Now remember, that suite was in an older building, so the door to this room was solid wood, with a panel of frosted glass and an old-fashioned brass doorknob. Suddenly the doorknob rattled, then it slowly turned. The hair on the back of our necks stood up as the door swung wide open. We all jumped about a mile. Of course, when we checked there was no one in the hallway.